Alaric's hand was steady as he passed me the cup, and I only noticed the wrongness of it because the wine caught the firelight the same way a healer's vial once had, years before I ever set foot in this palace. "Do not drink that," I said, loud enough to carry, and watched King Ronan's hand freeze halfway to his mouth. Alaric's composure slipped, just barely, just long enough for me to see the truth underneath it. "Finn," I said, the name still catching in my throat after a full month of using it. "I think he means to finish what he started with your brother." I did not know yet whether I had spoken in time. I only knew that a name I had never meant to give him had somehow become the thread that unraveled everything. Let me tell you how I ended up in that hall. Because it started a month earlier, on my first chaotic day at the palace, when I misheard a name meant for no one but a dead man's memory. I was 22, newly hired into the palace's household staff, and I arrived on a morning so thoroughly disorganized that I still marvel I made it through without losing something important entirely. 3 new servants had started that same day. All of us shuffled between stewards, who seemed to have 3 separate opinions each about where we were meant to be standing, and by the time I was finally shown to the linen stores, I had already forgotten the names of 2 housekeepers and 1 entire wing of the castle. It was in that chaos, passing a doorway near the king's private study, that I overheard 2 older attendants speaking in low, careful tones about the king's mood that morning. "He has not slept well," one said. "It happens, some years, around this time. He still will not hear anyone call him Finn, not since it happened, though I confess I understand why." I did not know, in that moment, whose grief they were discussing, or whose private nickname they had just spoken aloud in passing. I only knew that I had apparently just learnt the king's name, or so I believed entirely by accident, and I filed it away without a second thought, the way you file away any small useful fact on a chaotic first day. I met him myself an hour later, delivering a tray to his study because the usual attendant had been pulled elsewhere, and I said, with the particular unearned confidence of a new servant determined not to seem lost, "Your tea, Finn the room, went very still." I did not understand the stillness at the time. I set the tray down, curtsied as I had been instructed, and left, entirely unaware that I had just done something no one in that palace had done in 3 years. I called him Finn again the next morning, and the morning after that, and by the end of the first week it had simply become, in my own mind, the ordinary shape of his name, used without hesitation each time our paths crossed. I noticed, vaguely, that other servants seemed to flinch each time I said it. That guards near his study exchanged glances I did not fully understand, but I put it down to court formality I had not yet learned properly, and continued on, blissfully unaware of the small daily earthquake I was apparently causing. No one corrected me. That, more than anything, should have told me something was deeply strange about the situation, but I was too newly employed, and too grateful for steady work to question my own good fortune at apparently having learnt the king's preferred address so quickly. I began to notice small patterns, in that first week, that I did not yet know how to interpret. A junior guard would visibly hold his breath each time I approached the study door. A senior housekeeper began finding reasons to be elsewhere whenever I was sent to deliver anything to the king directly, as though she could not bear to witness the moment firsthand. Once, at supper in the servants' hall, an older cook told a younger one, in a hushed voice she clearly thought I could not hear, that the new girl was either the bravest or the most foolish person to enter that palace in a decade, and no one at the table seemed prepared to say which. It was Brogan, the king's second, who finally pulled me aside on the 10th day, his face doing the particular careful work of a man about to deliver news he expected to land badly. "You have been calling the king Finn," he said, without preamble. "Is that not his name?" I asked, genuinely bewildered. "It is not," Brogan said. "His name is Ronan." Finn was a private name, used only by one person who has not been alive to use it for 3 years now. I felt my stomach drop entirely. I did not know. I overheard 2 attendants speaking of it my first morning, and assumed, "I am aware of how the misunderstanding likely occurred," Brogan said, not unkindly. "I would simply ask you to stop, before the king finds the reminder more painful than he has let on." "Why did no one simply tell me sooner?" I asked, mortified. "You have all watched me say it for 10 days. Because every single time you said it," Brogan admitted, "the king's face did something none of us had seen it do in 3 years, and not one of us could bring ourselves to be the person who made that stop happening. I am only telling you now, because I have started to worry the kindness of it is outweighing the honesty owed to both of you." I resolved, immediately and thoroughly, to correct my error the very next time I saw him. I want it understood that I meant that resolution entirely sincerely. I simply did not manage to keep it. I found him in his study that same afternoon, prepared to apologize properly and address him correctly from that moment forward, and the apology died in my throat the instant I saw his face. Tired. Guarded, bracing visibly for whatever I was about to say. "Your Grace," I began, and watched something in his expression flicker, quick and involuntary. Disappointment layered so thin beneath his composure that I nearly missed it entirely. I do not fully understand, even now, what made me say what I said next instead of the correction I had planned. "Finn," I said instead, softer this time, "I am sorry. I did not know what I was saying that first day. I understand now, and I will use your proper name if that is what you would prefer." He was quiet a long moment, something moving behind his eyes that I did not yet have language for. "I did not ask you to stop," he said finally. "Brogan told me the name belonged to someone else, that it was not mine to use. It was never yours to learn in the first place," he said, "and yet I find I have not corrected you once in 10 days, despite having every opportunity to do so. I am beginning to suspect that tells you something my own composure has not managed to say plainly." I did not know what to do with that admission, so I said nothing, and simply set his tea down, and left him to whatever quiet he needed, though I noticed, walking away, that I had not actually promised to stop using the name after all. I continued calling him Finn for the following weeks, and he continued not correcting me, and the whole palace, I gradually understood, had settled into a kind of collective held breath around the situation. Guards straightening whenever I approached his study, nobles exchanging careful glances at supper whenever I addressed him directly, an entire court too frightened of disturbing something they did not understand to simply ask either of us plainly what was happening. I found myself, in those weeks, developing a strange fondness for the daily ritual it had become. Delivering his tea each morning, saying the name, watching the small private flicker cross his face, that he clearly believed he was hiding successfully from everyone in the room, myself included. I did not yet understand what I was witnessing. I only knew I looked forward to it more than any other part of my new position, which I found considerably more confusing than the mystery of the name itself. It was Brogan, again, who finally explained the fuller truth to me 3 weeks into my employment, once it had become clear that neither the king nor I intended to resolve the matter on our own. His brother was named Rhys, he told me, quietly, in a corridor well away from curious ears. 2 years younger, considerably more playful than the king ever was, and the only person alive who was ever permitted to call him Finn, a mocking nickname from a childhood incident involving a fish market and a badly aimed net, if the old stories are accurate. Rice died 3 years ago. A wasting illness, or so we were told. The king has not heard that name spoken since the funeral, until you arrived, and said it without knowing any better. And he has let me keep saying it, I said slowly, because I do not fully know why, Brogan admitted. I only know that whatever comfort or ache it gives him, it is clearly not one he wishes taken away, however much the rest of us have been quietly holding our breath about it. I found Ronan himself that same evening, in his study once again, and asked him plainly the question I had been circling since Brogan's explanation. "Why let me keep saying it?" I asked. "If it hurts you to hear it, I will stop entirely. If it does not, I would like to understand why." He set down the letter he had been reading and looked at me properly. Something raw, moving behind his usual careful composure. "It does hurt," he admitted. "Every single time. It also, somehow, in the same breath, feels like the first honest comfort I have had in 3 years. I did not know grief could hold both of those things at once until you walked into my study on your very first day and handed me back a piece of my brother I thought I had lost for good." "I am sorry for your loss," I said, "though I understand now that is a considerably smaller thing to say than the weight of what I have apparently been carrying without knowing it. You have carried it rather gracefully, for someone entirely unaware of what she was carrying," he said, something almost fond in his voice, despite the grief still evident beneath it. I find myself oddly grateful for the accident of it, even as I understand how strange that gratitude must sound. "It does not sound strange," I said. "It sounds like a man who has not had anywhere safe to put his grief in 3 years, finally finding somewhere by accident." Something in his face shifted at that, warm and startled, and I understood, in that small, unremarkable moment, exactly why an entire court had spent a month too afraid to disturb whatever fragile thing was happening between a new servant and her grieving king. "Tell me about him," I said, quiet, not the loss of him. "Who he actually was." Something eased in Ronan's face, remembering rather than grieving for once. Loud, considerably braver than he had any right to be, and utterly incapable of taking anything seriously, including me, which I found endlessly irritating as a boy, and would give almost anything to be irritated by again now. He used to sneak into the kitchens and steal pastries meant for formal suppers, and blame it on the dogs with total, shameless confidence. Every single time. Even when we had no dogs. "He sounds like he was considerably more fun than court life generally allows for," I said. "He was the only person who ever made this palace feel like a home rather than a duty," Ronan said. "I have not laughed properly, the way he used to make me laugh, since he died. I did not realize, until you started saying his name for me by accident, how much I had missed simply being reminded that I was allowed to. If you want to find out why King Ronan let a stranger call him by his dead brother's private nickname for an entire month without once correcting her, and what we discovered together about how that brother actually died, stay with me through to the end of this. Follow along, so you do not lose the thread of what happens when the wrong name turns out to be exactly the right one." Reese's death, I learned over the following days, had never been formally questioned beyond the physician's initial diagnosis of a wasting illness, a slow, unexplained decline that no remedy seemed to touch, ending within 2 months of its first symptoms. Ronan had been considerably younger himself at the time, freshly burdened with a crown he had not expected to inherit so soon, and had accepted the physician's account without pressing further, too grief-stricken in the moment to question a diagnosis delivered by a man he trusted. It was helping to sort old household records, a task Brogan assigned me partly to keep me occupied, and partly, I suspected, because he had begun to trust my discretion, that I found the detail that finally mattered. I had spent 2 long afternoons working through boxes of ledgers no one had properly organised since Reese's death, mostly out of a growing restlessness to be useful for something beyond delivering tea, when a single entry stopped me cold enough that I read it 3 times before I trusted my own eyes. The physician who had diagnosed Reese's illness had been quietly dismissed from royal service within a year of the death, his departure recorded only as a retirement, though the household ledger showed a payment considerably larger than any ordinary pension made to him the same month he left. Authorised, I noted with a growing chill, by Lord Alaric's own seal. I brought the ledger to Ronan and Brogan together, and watched Ronan's face go through something I had not yet seen from him. Not simply grief this time, but a cold, dawning fury directed somewhere considerably more specific than fate or illness. Alaric arranged the physician's silence, Brogan said slowly, reading the entry twice. Which means he had something to be silent about. My brother did not die of a wasting illness, Ronan said, his voice gone very quiet. Someone poisoned him, slowly enough to look like sickness, and Alaric paid the one man who would have known the difference to disappear, rather than say so. We moved carefully in the days that followed, Brogan quietly locating the dismissed physician, now living 2 territories away under a name that was not entirely his own, and it was his testimony, delivered under considerable persuasion and the promise of the Crown's protection, that finally confirmed what the ledger alone had only suggested. Rhys had shown every symptom of a specific, slow-acting poison, one requiring careful, sustained administration over weeks, rather than a single dose. The work of someone with regular, trusted access to the young prince's food and drink. Alaric had served as Rhys's own personal steward in those final months, a detail so obvious in hindsight that its significance had simply never been questioned by a grieving court too devastated to look for anything beyond illness. I understood, once the full shape of it settled over me, exactly what my own accidental presence had done. Alaric had spent 3 years watching a grieving king bury his suspicion alongside his brother, secure in the knowledge that no one would ever think to question a wasting illness 3 years gone. A new servant calling him by his brother's forbidden nickname, reopening a wound everyone had assumed was simply healing quietly, had apparently been enough to set the entire careful arrangement trembling. I sat with that particular guilt a long while, understanding that my own clumsy first-day mistake had, without my ever intending it, become the single loose thread that threatened to unravel a murder someone had spent 3 careful years keeping buried. I did not know whether to feel proud of the accident or frightened by what it had apparently already set in motion. Ronan did not let me carry that guilt alone. "You did not cause this," he said, when I finally admitted the shape of my own unease to him. Alaric caused this 3 years ago, and has been living on borrowed time ever since, whether either of us knew it or not. You simply gave the truth a door to walk through. That is not the same as opening it yourself. Alaric moved first, and moved through the safest channel available to a man of his standing. He arranged, quietly, for my reassignment to a distant household 2 territories away, citing a shortage of staff that did not actually exist. The paperwork routed through an understeward who owed him considerable favours. Ronan refused the transfer the moment he learned of it, publicly, in front of the very steward who had processed it, which I suspect told Alaric plainly exactly how much danger his careful arrangement was now in. I did not sleep easily in the days that followed, aware, in a way I had not fully allowed myself to be before, that I had become inconvenient to a man who had already proven, once, exactly how far he was willing to go to protect a secret. Brogan doubled the watch near my own quarters without being asked, and I noticed Ronan had taken to walking me personally between the study and the servants' hall each evening, a habit neither of us named aloud, but both of us understood the reason for. Even his wolf, usually content to remain near his own side during formal hours, began appearing at odd moments near wherever I happened to be working. A quiet, watchful presence I found I did not mind in the slightest. His second move came 4 nights later, in the great hall during a formal supper where Alaric, cornered by mounting evidence he could no longer ignore, apparently decided a more direct solution had become necessary. That is the scene I told you about at the very beginning of this. The cup passed across the table, the wine catching firelight wrong. My own voice, louder than I expected it to be, telling Ronan not to drink. The hall had gone utterly silent in the half-second after I spoke, every eye moving between the cup, Alaric's face, and my own, and I felt, for one long breath, the particular terror of having spoken a truth loudly enough that there was no way to take it back if I had somehow been wrong. I was not wrong. I watched that certainty land on Alaric's face at the same moment it landed on mine, and understood we had both just run out of quiet ways to resolve this. Brogan had the cup seized and tested within the hour, and the poison found within it matched, precisely, the compound the dismissed physician had described in his testimony, the same slow, careful poison that had killed Rhys, meant this time for the brother who had survived him. Alaric's composure, so carefully maintained through every prior confrontation, finally broke entirely under the weight of two matching pieces of evidence laid before the full court in a single evening. "I served this crown faithfully for 2 decades, he said, backing toward the hall's edge as guards closed around him. A servant's careless mistake with a name nearly cost me everything I built protecting this kingdom's stability during a difficult succession." "You did not protect this kingdom's stability," Ronan said. His voice gone very quiet and very dangerous, his wolf, restrained for 3 long grieving years, finally surging forward with a force that made the guard's job considerably easier. "You murdered my brother to secure your own influence over a young king you assumed would be easy to manage. And when a stranger's accidental kindness threatened to unravel that secret, you tried to finish what you started 3 years ago." He had no answer ready for that. In front of witnesses who would very much repeat every word of it by morning, Alaric was stripped of his standing and his freedom that same hour. His household seized for full investigation, and the physician's testimony, formally recorded before the Crown's own court, finally gave Rhys's death the truth it had been denied for 3 long years. A formal remembrance was held within the month, the first the court had ever properly given him beyond the original grief-stricken funeral, and I watched Ronan stand at the front of that gathering, dry-eyed but steady, finally able to grieve his brother as the murdered prince he actually was, rather than the quiet mystery everyone had simply agreed not to examine too closely. Ronan found me afterward in that same study, where all the true things between us had happened, holding a small carved wooden fish, Rhys's own, he told me later, a childhood keepsake from the very fish market incident that had given him his forbidden nickname in the first place. "I have spent a month letting a stranger call me by a name I told myself belonged only to grief," he said. "I do not think nearly losing you to Alaric's wine was the demonstration I had intended to finally understand what that name had actually become." "It worked anyway," I said, "though I would ask you not to repeat it. I do not intend to make a habit of it." He looked at the small wooden fish, then at me, something in his face finally losing the last of its grief-worn caution. "I do not know how to properly thank a woman who gave me back a piece of my brother by accident, and then helped me find the truth about how I lost him in the first place. I only know I am no longer interested in correcting the name you gave me on your very first day. Then I will keep using it," I said, properly this time. "Not by accident. On purpose, because it means something to both of us now." When he kissed me, careful and certain, a man who had spent 3 years afraid that grief and love could not occupy the same breath, I felt something in my chest. Some quiet, patient hope I had carried since the moment I first saw his face soften at a name I never meant to give him, finally settle. Somewhere beyond the study door, I heard his wolf let out a low, contented sound I had never once heard from it before, as though it too had simply been waiting 3 long years for permission to stop guarding a grief and start guarding something considerably warmer instead. He claimed me before the full court a month later, his hand steady on the old iron circlet, as he set it on my head himself, in front of every noble who had spent an entire prior month too frightened to explain why a new servant's mistaken address made their king's face do something none of them had seen in 3 years. Brogan stood near the front of that hall, looking, for the first time since Rhys's death, entirely unworried. One older duke, still visibly bewildered by the whole affair, asked me afterward, with genuine curiosity rather than malice, how a servant girl had managed to succeed where an entire trained court had failed for 3 years, simply by getting a name wrong. I told him the truth, which was that I had not succeeded at anything deliberate at all. I had simply been too new to know better than to say a name out loud, and sometimes, apparently. That is all a grieving heart actually needs. Someone who has not yet learned all the careful rules about what should not be said. 6 months later, I stood in that same study with a letter from my own family in one hand and Reese's small wooden fish, now kept on Ronan's own writing desk, rather than tucked away in a drawer, in the other. The letter asked, carefully, whether it was true that their daughter, hired as an ordinary palace servant, was queen of the realm now. I wrote back that it was true, and that it had all started because I could not properly hear a name over the noise of my own first chaotic day. My mother's reply, when it came, said only that she had always known my hearing was terrible, and that she was glad it had finally worked out in my favour for once. Brogan had stopped bracing every time Alaric's name came up in court proceedings, mostly, now that the man sat in a cell rather than a council chair. The physician, restored to honest standing once his testimony was formally recognised, had returned to royal service at Ronan's own invitation, this time with considerably more oversight than his position had ever received before. And the court, once so terrified of a name no one dared explain, had grown considerably more comfortable simply asking honest questions, rather than holding its breath around unspoken grief. Ronan had, in those 6 months, begun speaking of Reese freely for the first time since the funeral, small stories surfacing at supper or in idle afternoon conversation that I suspected he had been holding on to in silence for considerably longer than 3 years. I found I loved hearing them, each one a small piece of the brother I had never met, but had somehow, through nothing more than an accident of overheard conversation, helped bring back into the light. Brogan told me once that he had not seen the king laugh so easily in all the years he had served him, and that he considered it, privately, the finest thing my clumsy first day had ever accomplished. Ronan still let me call him Finn most evenings, when the formal business of the day had ended, and it was simply the two of us in that study, the name no longer a stranger's accident, but a private thing we had both chosen to keep. He had, at my own gentle suggestion, begun teaching the name to no one else. Precisely as it had always been meant, a thing shared between 2 people only. First a brother and a boy. Now a queen and the king she had never meant to fall in love with by accident. I turned the small wooden fish over in my fingers and thought about the woman who had walked into a palace on an ordinary chaotic morning, certain of nothing except that she had heard a name somewhere in the noise and intended to use it correctly. She had no idea, that first overwhelming day, that mishearing a whispered conversation, was about to become the truest gift she ever gave a grieving man. She only knew she wanted to get his name right. I like to think she would be glad, now, that she never quite managed to. I like to think, too, that somewhere in whatever comes after this life, a mischievous younger brother is considerably pleased with how thoroughly his old joke of a nickname ended up rewriting his brother's future. Do you think some part of Ronan recognised, from the very first moment I said it wrong, exactly how much he needed to hear that name again, or did it simply take a month of quiet courage from both of us to understand what the mistake had actually given him? Tell me your theory in the comments. And if you want to stay in this study a little longer, comment the wrong name, and I will know exactly what you are asking for. Thank you for standing in that chaos with me on my very first day. Wherever you are listening from tonight, welcome to Ronan's court. Follow along for the next story from this side of the border. There are more kings in these hills, carrying grief no one has found the right words to reach, waiting for someone who gets it wonderfully wrong. and I intend to tell you every one of their stories.